Welcome to Friday night's video and our Master Series. This is the 84th video in our Master Series in the intro to our mixing phases. And there will be 4 of them. I wanted to do this intro video because I wanted to address a couple things. The first thing that I wanted to address is if you watched all the videos in that last short series that was called Mixing Concepts, you really want to make good notes about those and really think about them and practice them and incorporate them into your mixing processes when we go through these phases. You will see that sometimes I will address them literally, but sometimes it's a situational thing, so that if I don't address it, then you're going to run into the issues while you're mixing and need to keep them in mind and make notes about them, or even make notes of them in your workflow at each of those phases and checklists to check those type of things and to really make sure that things are happening that way. The other thing you want to really keep in mind in those mixing concepts is that this initial phase of subgroup mixing, when the first phase of it, is that as we go through these, it's a work in progress. So you basically have to really keep in mind that you may get faster at doing it, but a lot of times things are 3 steps forward and 1 step back to go back and fix things. As you start mixing things together, that you run into issues and you're like, well, I can't just fix that now in this mixing phase. I got to go back to my subgroup mixing or my subgroup processing or my editing, or I have to go back into like my editing on the individual tracks, or the first phase processing on the individual tracks, and sometimes even re-record things because things ain't working out the way you thought, or they're not panning out and coming together the way you thought, and that's okay. Don't get frustrated about that, because that is part of you becoming in an individuality and understanding to do a good job. And as you get better at that you will do that better and quicker, more than likely, but it's just something that's a fact to do a good job and to really keep in mind so that you don't get frustrated. And there's another concept that the concept of the Ferrari. Before I get into that, I want to say that I always try to have it as a concept that every subgroup mix is like its own individual mix that will stand on its own. And that's something to really keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is the Ferrari concept. I'm going to take a picture of a Ferrari from a block away. One guy has spent 24 hours of fine detailing this whole Ferrari from, he spent 24 hours on it. The other guy spent an hour dusting it off and make sure it was okay and looked around at it, and then he was done. And from a block away, you can't tell the difference between those 2 pictures, and they look fine. Both of them look fine. You can stick both of them on that poster. Does that make sense? It can be the same problem with audio engineering. Can you hear it or not? It can be a problem because depending on it can cause your production to go 2 ways, and mixing phases are some of the most important phases that are really good, because as you go through the mixing phases, you're going to go back and fix shit that's going to make or break your production, that you take the time to go back and fix it or not. And there's a concept that you can die in front of the mixing console trying to fine tune your mix, and it can be very literally true. And there's also the concept that you don't do a good job because you don't think you need to, and your production goes in the garbage can. There might be one little bit of volume automation that you really needed to work on for that out front vocal, that to make it really shine, that you didn't, and so it's never going to be that radio ready production because you didn't spend the time on it. As you get better, you will have to learn to trust your judgment and know when that's true and when that isn't, and to keep those 2 things from happening, and to just get a good job done and not get caught and wrapped up in that. That's a huge concept to really get into your head. Now, another thing is automation. When you get into the mixing, that automation is your buddy, because like I said, just a little bit of automation, and there might be 4 spots in your production that you really needed to go do some fine-tuning automation, or really need to go in there with your EQ automation, or just a little bit of EQ and just little teeny fine detail stuff that made your production go from that doesn't sound too bad to wow, bro. Does that make sense? And that is very true. So really spend the time thinking about that, because you'll find that a lot of times, if you do a really good job on all the things I tell you to do, that sometimes that it's not such a thing as just putting up a fader or adjusting. You really got to get in there and do some detail work on some certain area. So really get to know your automation tools so that you can use them, your volume automation, panning automation, automation on the different parameters of your processors and basic processors and things like that when you're working on things, to make adjustments and do a good job. Really keep that in mind. And then besides that, you really want to understand, being able to revisit things is okay. Going back to revisit your first phase processing or your editing or whatever you need to go back and do, it's okay. Just try not to get wrapped up in I'm going to die in front of my mixing console kind of thing. As you get better, they'll get faster. You get around somebody that's been doing this for years, bro, and they're like, they get their mix done, and you're sitting there going, dude, I spent like a week on mine. And the guy's like, I spent like an hour and a half on mine, bro. And it's like, well, they might have spent more time on it than that, but you have to understand that they really, have had experience working on it to where the experience you don't have. And so you're going to have to work through that experience to where it's okay. People come up to you and say, well, I spent, 4 hours working on this kick drum, and they're like, bro, you spent 4 hours working on your kick drum? Yeah, bro, because I'm not that experienced and I really want it to be good. As you get better, as you start to do those things and you're going through mixing, because you'll go back and revisit things to make things sure things are correct. That's that dying in front of the mixing console thing that sometimes people talk about. That's okay, because as you do it, you'll do it less and less. Sometimes you'll go back and go, really, I really do need to fuss with that much. And sometimes you'll get to an experience point to where you'll be like, no, bro, I know that kick drum, I'm doing that with that. I know that's going to happen, and I'm done. I'm not going to sit there for 4 hours with it, because I know I've done that kick drum 100 times like that, and it's come out and sounded great just like that. And just be careful of getting caught up in that thing that it can't get better. So just always remember that, keep that in mind as you get better, and always make good notes, good checklists and workflows for all your phases to do a really good job. But these last 4 phases are really important. And as we go through these last 4 phases, just remember that for the most part, you've got like subgroup mixing, that you're going to get things mixed to these subgroups. You're going to go do subgroup processing, which is basically trying to fine tune any type of processing that you can do on that subgroup that's basically coming out as sounding like a mix, and make it sound as good as possible, and do some really fine tuning. Any major work, you want to go back to those individual tracks and fuss with. And you get in your group mixing that you really want to get in there, do a group mix, and then get in with your automation and do a really good job with your automation of fine tuning it so it's as good as possible. And then in the end, processing of the whole mix, which basically is the same thing like subgroup mixing or processing, that you're just trying to fine tune things. If you've got major issues, you go back to those individual tracks or those individual subgroups and address it there. But if you can't, or if you not need to, a lot of times, like, you'll see videos of somebody going through their final mix and they push the EQ up just a little bit right there at 600 hertz. And you're going, dude, I spent 12 hours on my mix. I had the EQ every which way but sideways. And it's like, because they went through the whole thing and just with the whole mix, and that might have been for one section. They might have just automated the EQ that at this one chorus section, the EQ needed to have that little bump right there with automation on it to make it sound really good as a mix, as a whole. Does that make sense? But if it was anything else, they went back and fussed with it on the individual tracks or the individual subgroups to get them to sound good, so that they really didn't have to do all this major processing on a whole mix, because there was no need to, because everything was going together great, and any issues they ran into, they went back and addressed those issues in other areas, so they don't have to do a a whole lot of heavy processing and leave a lot of processors on a bunch of buses at the end of their mixes. Does that make sense? And it's a real simple concept that you will eventually understand as you get better, and you'll get better at it and do a good job of it and not have that frustrate you so much. So just keep that in mind. So besides that, just remember, as we get into subgroup mixing, there's 4 separate phases, or we get into this mixing concepts, there's 4 phases of it, and that's basically what we're trying to do. So we'll get into the subgroup mixing first, and we'll get those done as individual mixes that we can bring up into the mix after we get done with our subgroup processing as separate mixing entities off of a bus. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoy these 4 phases in our mixing concepts, and I'll see you in the next video when we get into subgroup mixing.